In 1970, a 31-year-old government census worker disappeared while conducting door-to-door surveys in the rural backroads of Trinity County, California. But 13 years later, a federal informant would lead agents to a rotting root cellar, and what they found buried there would unravel a hidden network no one had seen coming. It was early autumn, 1983. A dense fog clung to the tree line outside Redding, California, where the morning sun had yet to break through. Rebecca Mallory stood in the gravel lot behind St. Joseph's Medical Center, her nurse's scrubs slightly damp from the coastal chill that seemed to seep through everything in these mountains. She'd just finished her third consecutive night shift in the ICU, but instead of heading home to her small apartment, she waited for a car, unmarked, government-issued, to pick her up. She was 38 now, no longer the young woman who had frantically called police stations 13 years ago, demanding answers that never came. The lines around her eyes had deepened from years of sleepless nights, her auburn hair now pinned back in a tight bun, more out of habit than vanity. The wedding ring she'd once worn was long gone, her marriage another casualty of the consuming grief that had defined her adult life. For over a decade, she'd lived with the weight of not knowing what had happened to her older sister Diane, the census worker who had simply vanished into the Northern California wilderness. The day before, Agent Jacobs had called her at the hospital with unexpected news. His voice was measured, professional, but she could hear something underneath. Excitement, maybe even relief. After 13 years of silence, something had been found. Something tied directly to Diane's disappearance. He wouldn't give details over the phone, but he needed Rebecca to come in. There were items that required family identification, evidence that might finally provide the answers she'd stopped believing would ever come. Diane Mallory was a dedicated field agent for the U.S. Census Bureau, one of the few women in her department willing to take on the most challenging rural assignments. In the summer of 1970, she was assigned to canvass sparsely populated rural districts in Northern California's Trinity County, an area known for its spread-out homesteads. It was a thankless job that required long drives on treacherous mountain roads, unpredictable terrain, and often unwelcoming residents who might greet a census worker with hostility rather than cooperation. Diane approached her work with methodical precision. She carried detailed maps, maintained meticulous records, and always checked in with her supervisor by radio at predetermined times. Her colleagues respected her thoroughness, and supervisors trusted her to handle the most difficult territories that other agents avoided. On July 17, 1970, Diane set out to survey properties along a remote stretch of Old Bucktail Road, an area dotted with abandoned farmsteads and the few remaining residents who had chosen isolation over community. The road itself was barely maintained, more of a logging trail that wound through dense forest and across seasonal creek beds. She was equipped with her standard government radio, census forms, and satchel. She made her last check-in by radio just before noon, reporting that she had completed 3 addresses and was proceeding to the final 2 properties on her list. Her voice was calm, professional. There was no indication of any problems. When she failed to report back that evening at the scheduled 6 p.m. check-in, her supervisor, Robert Tomlinson, grew concerned. Tomlinson had worked with Diane for 3 years and knew she was never late with her reports. By morning, when she still hadn't returned to the district office, he had contacted local authorities and initiated a full-scale search. Her government vehicle, a tan Ford sedan with U.S. Census Bureau identifiers, was found 3 days later at the end of a narrow dirt path that branched off from Old Bucktail Road. The car was positioned as if she had parked deliberately, not abandoned in haste. The driver's side door was unlocked, the keys still in the ignition. The radio was silent, its battery drained. On the passenger seat lay her detailed survey map, marked with completed addresses in her precise handwriting. But one address, an unregistered, long-abandoned homestead deep in the forest, wasn't listed in any of the official survey records. Diane had written it in by hand. Old Murphy Place, 1/2 mile past creek crossing, structure visible from road. The search operation that followed spanned 6 counties and involved local police, Trinity County Sheriff's Department, forestry officials, and federal agents from both the Census Bureau and FBI. Helicopters swept the dense tree canopy, their searchlights cutting through the forest darkness. Bloodhounds tracked faint scents through the underbrush, often losing the trail where the scent seemed to simply vanish. Ground teams combed every trail, every abandoned cabin, every hunting camp within a 20-mile radius. The abandoned property near where her car had been found became the primary focal point of the investigation. Local records showed the homestead had belonged to the Murphy family until 1962, when the last surviving member had died. But investigators noted disturbing signs of recent activity: fresh tire tracks that didn't match Diane's vehicle, discarded food packaging, and evidence that someone had been using the old well. This evidence led nowhere, though. Whoever had been there had left no trace to follow. The case remained officially open for over a year, but leads dried up as winter made the remote areas inaccessible. Rumors swirled through the tight-knit mountain communities about survivalist groups, anti-government enclaves, and rogue militia cells using the remote hills as hideouts, but nothing could be proven. Some locals whispered about strange lights seen in the forest at night, unfamiliar vehicles on logging roads, and the sound of gunfire from areas where no hunting was supposed to occur. But when federal agents followed up on these reports, they found nothing but empty forest. By 1972, the investigation had been officially classified as cold. Robert Tomlinson retired 2 years later, haunted by his inability to find answers about his missing colleague. In the spring of 1983, everything changed. A federal informant who had spent months embedded in a fringe anti-government militia operating out of southern Oregon began passing along information about historical crimes tied to earlier splinter groups. The informant, known only by the code name Redwood, had gained the trust of militia members who spoke freely about past operations and lessons learned from previous cells that had been dissolved or discovered. One story in particular caught FBI agent Jacobs's attention during a routine intelligence briefing. Redwood reported hushed conversations about a government worker who had wandered too close to one of the group's safe houses more than a decade earlier. According to the story, she had been handled quietly by a paranoid cell leader who believed she was conducting surveillance rather than a legitimate census. The dates, summer of 1970, and the location, remote Northern California, lined up perfectly with Diane Mallory's disappearance. On September 24, 1983, acting on Redwood's detailed intelligence, a federal search team followed the informant's hand-drawn map to an unmarked wooded area in Trinity County, a location so remote it was barely accessible by foot, requiring a 2-hour hike through dense forest from the nearest logging road. The team consisted of FBI agents, forensic specialists, and teams equipped with ground-penetrating radar and metal detectors. What they found was a moss-covered wooden hatch, roughly 4 feet square, obscured by more than a decade of overgrowth. Ferns and small saplings had grown over and around it, making it nearly invisible to anyone not looking specifically for a concealed entrance. The wood was rotting but still structurally sound enough to support the weight of the vegetation above. Inside was a shallow, deteriorated root cellar adjacent to the collapsed remains of what had once been a substantial barn. The air was thick with the smell of decay and stagnant water. On a rotting wooden shelf, partially protected from the elements by an oilcloth covering, lay a sealed canvas satchel bearing the faint flaked print of the U.S. Census Bureau seal. Inside the satchel, a rusted clipboard held a partially legible census form with Diane's signature clearly visible at the bottom, along with her federal ID number stamped in blue ink. Her name was still readable on the inner flap of the bag, written in the same precise handwriting they remembered from her personnel files. But it was what they found beneath the rotting floorboards that confirmed their worst fears. A shallow depression in the earth had been deliberately disturbed, The soil was looser, darker, and contained fragments of fabric and what looked like a piece of canvas. Though the team stopped short of immediate exhumation, waiting for the proper team to get on site. The evidence was undeniable. Diane had been here, and she hadn't left alive. The truth came together in fragments. The militia group had briefly occupied the abandoned farmhouse in 1970, planning to use it as a stopover before moving north. Their leader, a former Vietnam veteran named Gerald Sykes, had a long history of paranoia and anti-government rage. The FBI had linked him to arson and weapons trafficking in the late 60s, but charges had never stuck. According to the informant, Diane had approached the house as part of her route. The property had been abandoned for some time. Sykes panicked, convinced she'd recognize him or report the group's location. Most of his followers were hesitant, but he insisted she was a threat. Sykes knew they couldn't stay at the location now, no matter what. The decision was made to kidnap Diane and move her to deal with her elsewhere, a location that wouldn't soon be crawling with federal agents seeking answers. In the years that followed, Sykes would surface in 2 other militia cells tied to extremist activities and anti-government demonstrations. But no case had ever led back to him until now. After stabilizing the root cellar's structure, the FBI returned in early 1984 to conduct a full excavation. Nearly 5 feet below the surface, wrapped in layers of canvas and plastic sheeting, they recovered the skeletal remains of Diane Mallory. Her jawbone was intact. Dental records confirmed the match. Her body had been buried deliberately, positioned, not dumped. Alongside her remains was a steel lockbox sealed shut by corrosion. When the lockbox was finally opened back in D.C., its contents shifted the case entirely. Inside were 2 sets of hand-drawn maps and a list of names with coded aliases, entries the Bureau would later tie to a network of extremist cells operating across 3 western states. One of the maps outlined a remote forest parcel in Nevada. When agents searched the site, they uncovered a buried shipping container filled with modified rifles and explosives traced to a 1969 military shipment theft. That evidence directly linked Gerald Sykes, long suspected but never charged, to multiple plots spanning over a decade. Sykes was arrested 6 weeks later outside Reno, Nevada, living under a false identity. At the time of his arrest, he was carrying a forged passport and a loaded revolver. He eventually confessed to Diane's murder, and the maps and recovered evidence was enough to convict him on federal weapons and conspiracy charges. He died in federal custody in 1989. Rebecca never got to bury her sister in the traditional sense. Diane's remains were considered evidence for too long, and by the time they were released, Rebecca chose cremation over a delayed funeral. But she got something more valuable, the truth, and with it, a form of peace she had never expected to find. The unanswered years, the false leads, the long silences filled with desperate hope. They had taken their toll on every aspect of her life. Her marriage had crumbled under the weight of her obsession with finding answers. Her career had suffered as she spent countless hours following up on reported sightings and potential leads. But now, finally, there was closure. She returned once to the Trinity County Forest in the summer of 1986 and stood silently at the edge of the clearing where the hidden cellar lay beneath the recovering forest floor. She scattered some of Diane's ashes there among the tall pines and wildflowers that had grown over the site. She never went back, but she no longer felt the compulsive need to search, to question, to hope for impossible reunions. The story of Diane Mallory became required reading in federal law enforcement training programs across multiple agencies, not just as a case study of a missing agent, but as an example of how a single victim's death could provide the key evidence needed to expose and dismantle a much larger threat. The network that Sykes had been part of was systematically dismantled over the following 2 years, leading to dozens of arrests and the prevention of multiple planned attacks on government facilities. One routine knock on a door meant to count the living for the national census, had unknowingly triggered the unraveling of something much larger and far more dangerous than anyone had imagined. In death, Diane Mallory had accomplished what years of federal investigation had failed to achieve: the complete exposure of a domestic terrorist network that had been hiding in plain sight among the remote communities of the American West.